Okay, the invitation to speak today was to address the subject of the theology of pluralism, which is a little bit awkward since I'm not trained in theology, but in philosophy and ethics. So this paper focuses on the broader philosophical aspects of this theological subject, and I judge that in this multilingual, multi-interest context, any technical philosophical analysis wouldn't be very helpful. And so the paper this afternoon ranges quite widely, but it does nonetheless seek to submit some kind of philosophical discipline. The very situation in which we find ourselves in this room illustrates the whole problem. But perhaps the very limitations of this conference can teach us important things about the question of translating the gospel to those who have little of that shared understanding. Translation of any kind requires the play of the imagination. Without it, for example, in the area of subtitles on television, you've all seen the subtitles on television, unless the translator has used his or her imagination, you either get very stilted and formal translation, or you get complete nonsense, very often with live broadcasts. So I've decided to explore this question via the link between pluralism and the imagination. The imagination involves the capacity to see things that things may be other than we have hitherto conceived them to be. That relations between things may be construed in ways other than those that we have traditionally employed. This, in a very simple way, brings us, I think, to the very heart of pluralism. It is about the legitimacy of the other on our attention. It is about, and it's in the context of the translatable gospel, it asks this question: how much can I approximate in order to communicate effectively to that other and yet retain loyalty to the essence of that gospel? How much approximation? That's where I'm going. One or two rules for procedure, not for this paper simply, but I think for the rest of the conference. Just some ground rules. One, we need to be upfront, I think, that this is a potentially threatening subject. And so we need consciously to try to put fear to one side, fear of the other. We need to put defensiveness against all who disagree with us to one side, exaggerated concerns about our own identity, anxiety about increasing Adventist market share, if I can put it that way. All of these things distort our judgment. That's the first thing. Secondly, that we do need, as honestly as we can, to consider the evidence before us without undue special pleading, and recognize that this is not always easy for anyone who is committed to one particular tradition. 3, we, at the same time, can have, I think, an open and modest confidence in our own community of faith. And we should feel, fourthly, under no pressure to move away from our faith commitments, but certainly an obligation to deepen them. And 5, we should agree that our task here at this conference is collaborative rather than competitive. Conferences, even Adventist conferences, can on occasion become competitive. It's not pleasant. I'm going to argue that the imagination can take us places beyond the point where traditional philosophy and theology can take us. And I will further argue this, I believe this quite strongly, that the future of our church, the very future of our church, depends on keeping the Adventist imagination alive and well. And so I want to begin this afternoon by asking you to use your imaginations. I've created 3 stories, very postmodern. Philosophers often use stories to navigate different problems, and I hope that these stories, if you forget everything I say, you may remember the stories, and perhaps we can refer to them if we get stuck. So the first story is about the most wonderful wife in the world. Imagine, if you will, at supper tonight, that the conversation among a group of us turns to our families and specifically our wives. One of us sings his wife's praises, that she keeps the home spotlessly clean, that she produces exotic cuisine, that she caters effortlessly for numerous guests, that she nurtures the children lovingly, that in truth she's a better preacher than you are, that she plays the harp very well, that she does good oil paintings, that she goes jogging every morning, and most importantly, she shows you, her husband, tender attentiveness. This colleague concludes that he has the most wonderful wife in the world. I submit that it is unlikely that at that point another colleague will jump up angrily and claim that this is untrue, because it is in fact he who has the most wonderful wife in the world. It is unlikely that this second colleague will say that you would expect all of these things that have just been mentioned, all of these qualities in an averagely good wife. But in addition, his wife has just completed a doctorate in Aramaic, runs marathons, and can strip down the engine of a car. The second one would want to claim that it is in fact he who has the most wonderful wife in the world. It's unlikely that others will join in the contest. It's unlikely that supper will end in hostilities, because we can live happily with the idea that the title, the best wife in the world, can be awarded to many women, because this is not a judgment of fact, but an assertion of personal commitment. A subjective, not an objective claim. The first colleague is in fact saying that his wife is uniquely suited to partner him through life. The story of the most wonderful wife in the world argues that if our commitment in our personal relationships is absolute but subjective, why could that not also be true of our religious commitments? If we can live happily with colleagues who claim that their wife is simply above all others in virtue, why can we not live happily with others who claim that their God or their way is similarly above all others in virtue? Why do we feel that we are involved in some kind of spiritual struggle to defend and promote our view of the Eternal One? Translation of the colleague's claims is simply not necessary, though the conversation about wives may be interesting. So that's the story of the most wonderful wife in the world. Story number 2. Here I invite you to put your mind into a Catholic setting, a medieval Catholic setting. I do that because sometimes if we look at our own issues obliquely from the point of view of another tradition, so it's a little easier to handle them sometimes. So this from a Catholic setting. And this incidentally gives my paper, Pluralism, a view from a philosopher's window. This is where the title comes from this story. Imagine, if you will, a monastery at the heart of which is a cloister. Amazingly enough, these religious institutions have kept at their heart an open and quiet space. We need to think about that. An open and quiet space. The monks have cells which look down on the cloister. One day, the abbot of the monastery decides to install a sculpture in the middle of the cloister to aid reflection. When one monk first sees it from his cell, he describes it as being in the shape of an S. Another monk, whose cell is on the opposite side of the cloister, sees it as being a reverse S, of course. Still another monk, whose cell is on the third side of the cloister, says that it's simply a straight vertical shape. A fourth monk, whose cell is opposite the third, agrees with him. If the 4 monks were to come down into the cloister, they would come to understand that all of their descriptions are correct. The shape of the sculpture looks different according to which cell window you view it from. The different accounts actually describe the same reality. It's simply that each of the monks is viewing it from the perspective of their cells. The story of the cloister says that if the location of our personal cell is so crucial in determining what we see down there in the public space of the cloister, may it not be that when it comes to religious realities that perspective is all? That no one is able to give an exclusive account of what the sculpture represents, nor of what reality is like. It is what it is. It demands no interpretation, no translation is necessary. That's the story of the windows on the cloister. Now, to my third story. Imagine, if you will, yourself wandering in an old quarter of a city somewhere in Europe. Narrow, winding streets, no good for cars, interesting little shops, all sorts of smells, the sun peeping through only from certain angles, and sooner or later you will come to the cathedral and to the marketplace. Flowers, vegetables, cheeses, meats, handbags, jeans, souvenirs for tourists. Leave the noisy, bustling marketplace and enter the cathedral. This is a much quieter, darker, quite different world. In medieval times, the priest, Thomas, spent much of his life within the church, studying and going through the routines of worship and waiting for people to come through the doors for services. But the monk, Gregory, would often go out into the marketplace to spread some gospel kindness or a little gospel fear. Those who went out regularly into the marketplace were called seculars, from the Latin seculum, which means this present and temporal world. That's where we get the word from. Thomas, the priest, and his brothers notice that when Gregory comes back into the cathedral, he has the muck of the marketplace on his sandals, the smell of the marketplace on his clothes, the language of the marketplace in his ears, and in truth, some of the values of the marketplace in his mind. The story of Gregory, the secular monk, affirms that as believers translate the gospel in the marketplace, they themselves become affected inevitably by it for good or ill. Between the church and the marketplace, there is always and inevitably two-way traffic. Ultimately, Gregory's attempts at translation become more like paraphrase. The three stories raise fundamental questions which anyone interested in translating the gospel must face about the so-called scandal of particularity, about absoluteness, about the universality of the claims of the gospel, about power, about whether being pure, being truthful, is compatible with being social. The stories raise questions about the desirability, the possibility, and the means of translation. As I come to the section on secular pluralism, some of you will be well aware of this, I'll just do it very quickly. As Adventists, we would wish to say that a religious view of the world better describes the reality which is before us than does an account which eliminates God from the picture. But if we are to take the task of translation seriously, we must try to confront the robust claims of secularists over recent centuries, and I'm just going to select a few of the countless expressions of secular pluralism. In the 18th century, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume was quite clear about the matter. The special claims of one religion or one charismatic leader to revelation and miracle cancelled out rival claims, leaving a residue of precisely nothing. Religious pluralism would leave the dispassionate observer to discount altogether any religious view of the world, whatever it was, and seek a purely empirical account. Religions, according to Hume, are local fictions not worthy of translation or transmission. His position is little different from that of another Enlightenment figure, the Frenchman Denis Diderot, who scoffed that we are like human ants running over the face of our earth, all claiming that our anthill is alone dear to God. As one-time editor of the vast Enlightenment Manifesto, l'Encyclopédie des Arts, des Sciences et des Métiers, he was persuaded that religion had no place in the encyclopedia, which was trying to assemble everything then known to be true. Religion he merely dismissed as dangerous, culturally determined enthusiasms and fictions. The developing skepticism of the 18th century paved the way for plural explanations of religious behaviour in the 19th century. Feuerbach argued that if God were a reality to birds, God would be a winged creature. In other words, a direct translation. Marx famously asserted that religion was an opiate to the oppressed poor, a fiction offering a way of coping with grinding poverty. Nietzsche proclaimed that God was dead, that Christianity had become a kind of Latin, a dead language of which translation was no longer needed. Freud later said that religion was an illusion based on the immature desire to return to the safety of a father's care. Religion was simply autobiography. Autobiography lives stand alone and are not comparable or translatable. In the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein explained plurality of belief in terms of playing our own language games. So religions are like languages. They are not true or false. They are not good or bad. They just are the same way that Spanish just is. And so we speak Adventist or Catholic or Buddhist or Hindu. This is the language that we use to understand our world. We are Adventist in the same way that some people are French speakers, others German speakers. And there are many languages used to understand the world, many dialects, many forms of discourse within one language, all of which have their own integrity. But languages take a long time to learn, and the fact is that often, particularly English-speaking people, I confess, we're too lazy to bother. That also applies to the church. You've heard a number of people struggle with postmodernism already today. Let me give my take on it. Postmodernism gives us another view onto the nature of pluralism. While there are probably as many forms of postmodernism as there are postmodernists, many would say that what distinguishes postmodernism is precisely the demand to engage with another worldview with a view to replacing it. The project of deconstruction is to enable reconstruction to take place ad infinitum. Thus, engagement is necessary, and mere pluralism is no way forward. Postmodernism means the end of history, culture, the book, the self, and of course God as final unifying concepts. These concepts offer comprehensive unifying force. As such, they are exclusive, often oppressive, and thus are not fit for the purpose of living well in the modern world. In postmodernism, engagement and translation are necessary but difficult. Pluralism, then, is akin to that form of multiculturalism, where many ethnic styles coexist without necessarily ever touching or influencing each other. Some live in the inner city, some live in the suburbs, some live in the countryside. They rarely meet, and they are happy with this state of minimalist coexistence. Others would say this is mere sham, this is mere internationalism, and it is not true multiculturalism at all. True multiculturalism does not exist unless the various cultures actually engage with each other. You are well aware of many expressions of secular pluralism, and so I will not dwell on them. At best, the gospel is simply one phenomenon among others. At worst, it is a sort of virus which will one day be eliminated. No translation is necessary. secular pluralism. Then let me move quickly to religious pluralism. And I have a section here describing conservative Christianity. I'm going to skip that, I think. I mean, it all focuses around there being, Acts chapter 14, verse 18, no other name given under heaven among mortals by which men must be saved. But we are ourselves conservative Christians, and so know roughly what it's about. But under conservative Christianity, and one of its strengths perhaps, is that there is an urgency to translate the gospel. It is vital because of the mission. So let us consult two philosophical pioneers in this field by way of reality check. The British philosopher John Hick has written extensively and suggested a number of ways in which we can approach the tensions posed by competing religious claims. He argues that we experience the world as different things, experiencing as. So, as you walk along a forest path, as darkness falls, you see ahead of you in the distance what you think is another human being coming towards you on the path. Your companion, on the other hand, thinks it's not a person, but a bush. Another 200 meters shows you both to be wrong. It is, in fact, a sign on the footpath. Experiencing reality as something. He says that's what we all do. Hick also advanced the idea of eschatological verification. We all proceed along our life's path with our varying perceptions of the landscape which surrounds us. Finally, with our journey completed, we shall see things as they truly are, but such knowledge is only accessible as we round the final bend in the road and see that some were right and some were wrong. Moving now to another big name in this area, to Paul Nitter in his work, which was published in 1985, still widely quoted, called No Other Name. And he provides an extensive critical survey of Christian attitudes towards other world religions. He provides a number of options. Let me just mention a few. Number one, firstly, that one view that there is salvation only through Jesus Christ. God speaks in many different accents. There's a general stirring of God's Spirit. Jesus is truly the one and only Son of God. Christ's atoning work is of paramount importance for every human being. All religions are preparatory to Christianity, and none bring salvation in and of themselves. However, God is at work in other religions. Christianity is radically different, but not discontinuous from other religions. Translation then remains an important activity. Secondly, according to Nitter, he argues that while the message of the New Testament may be Christocentric, the language of Jesus himself was theocentric. It was the early church which brought us the view of Jesus which we've generally operated with. Actually, none of the images of Jesus in the New Testament are absolute. Jesus was a Son of God. The eschaton did not materialize as Jesus himself had expected. Jesus was a man who was radically human and radically open to God. But the main weakness of such a view is that the resurrection becomes surplus to requirements and not the very heart of faith. No urgent act of translation is necessary here, but there is a call to be radically human. A third option that Nitter gives comes from the work of Carl Gustav Jung, who says that we all have a common psychic origin and an inner energy waiting for realizations. And so we are addressed via archetypes like the Divine Mother, the Dying God, the Young Virgin, the Hero Saviour, the Cunning Devil, Hidden Treasure, and so on. Man is naturally religious, according to Jung. God expresses himself in many languages, so we are not responsible for translation services. And actually, I think Jung would say translation may sometimes be harmful. God is not separable from the self. Jesus was the highest expression of the mature spiritual self. God shows himself present by bringing wholeness, peace, and willingness to accept responsibility for action. God comes to us via our minds. The incarnation was not absolutely essential. Number 4, it's one step from saying that all personal experiences, all personal religious experiences are the same, to saying that all religions are the same, that they have a common essence, a common core, and so on. All traditions bring with them many local accretions, and constant demythologization is required. But no local exclusivism is possible. We get to the universal only through the particular, and therefore the scandal of particularity has its own didactic value. God is not willing that any should perish. Translation is important for better mutual understanding, en route to some sort of global theology which is necessary in our global village. Lastly, as he gives more than this, but the last one I'll deal with. This last view is truly a religious response that is to be found in doing rather than in knowing. We do the truth. We don't believe the truth. We don't know the truth. We do the truth. And since this is typical of the Jewish tradition in which Christianity has its roots, we should take note. Doing leads to knowing rather than knowing leading to doing. It emphasizes sympathetic understanding, genuine listening, the openness of the imagination, passing over to the other ground and coming back with insights gained. It happily lives with paradox. It's based on myths found to be reliable because they tell the truth. This way is inevitably prophetic in nature and practical in commitment. It may not be too great a step from here to the maxim that belonging comes before believing, which you've all heard and it's very popular. The gospel under this heading is translated supremely into action. And then on to the third section on Christian pluralism. Conservative Christians, maybe ourselves, would struggle to see that any of the above offer a good way of understanding religious difference. And so I'll come now to Christian pluralism. And I think it is official Seventh-day Adventist teaching that our church offers the final and purest refinement of Christian teaching and discipleship over against, say, Lutheranism, Anglicanism, or Orthodoxy, or any of the others. I'm going to move quickly over this form of pluralism, since the differences between Christian communities of faith are often rehearsed in our Adventist communities. Indeed, our Adventist resistance to liturgical, Pentecostal and spiritualist churches is part of the way that we have identified ourselves historically. Perhaps this explains why those Adventists who engage in ecumenical conversations are treated with a measure of suspicion. If you want confirmation of that, talk to Bert Beach. We are nervous about those who speak the same language as us but use a slightly different dialect. There are close to 1,000 recognized expressions of Christianity in the world today, and many more unofficial outcrops. Oppositions are sometimes discourteous, even violent, and based on all kinds of doctrinal, historical, liturgical, and political differences. In the language of translations, we Adventists would like to see ourselves as the authoritative New Revised Standard Version. Or to change the metaphor and to appeal to our French brethren, we are a bit like the Académie Française, which was established in 1635 to protect the purity of the French language, to protect it from the intrusions from other languages like English, to protect it against all kinds of Anglicisms like le parking, awful, Le shampoing, the shampooing, even worse. And I understand that the Académie Française tried to insist on le courriel for email, without success, I think. Or again, I hardly dare this comparison, but maybe we're a bit like Basque separatists. We are strangely nervous about our Christian cousins. We could go into that, you know a lot of this stuff, but I don't think we can talk about pluralism in general without talking about Christian pluralism and what Adventist attitudes are like and why we're so nervous about it sometimes. Now I come to Adventist pluralism. This is where it gets more controversial. It may be that our own experience of Adventist pluralism will inform our conversation about pluralism generally. Recognizing with some regret that even our own community of faith is fragmented, we actually may wish to say that the particular point at which you locate yourself on the remarkably broad spectrum of Seventh-day Adventist Christianity, we might want to say that my point on the spectrum, the Adventist spectrum, is the best. Is that not true? Some would say that today it is difficult to speak of Seventh-day Adventism, rather that there are many Seventh-day Adventisms, though we might be a little reluctant to concede that. There are many questions of doctrine, church politics, finance, evangelistic style, lifestyle, ethics, worship style, church order, cultural accretions, leadership style, and membership, which divide us. We are perhaps centrally united by our celebration of the Sabbath, as Catholics are united by the celebration of the Mass. Is this enough to hold us together as fractures over authority, hermeneutics, ordination, worship threaten to divide us? You know, and I know, Adventists from a particular and part of the Adventist family which is distant from where we happen to be. Can we call it the Adventist family? You know some Adventists who can be as irritating and as resistant to our own ideals for the church as any estranged uncle or cousin. How do we speak to and of our fellow Adventists? How do we translate the gospel to each other? When the Adventist Theological Society and the Adventist Society for Religious Studies sometimes can barely speak to each other, we have to admit to our shame that we as Adventist academics are no experts on the translation of important ideas in a plural environment. Unless we concede that, unless we struggle with that, this conference is pointless in my view. It's true that the Adventist Church has not suffered major schism over its 150 years, and that may encourage us to think that the gospel is translatable. The difficulties that we experience in the act of translating amongst ourselves may suggest that there is no easy way of doing it successfully beyond our own borders. I think we've got to be really honest about that and look at our act of translation within the church as we look at that without. Okay, so to the conclusion, and I do have, I'm not just going to drift into some vague ending. Here are some things for your consideration and acceptance. Number one comes really from the work of Leslie Newbegin, who was one of the early fathers, a missionary, long-time missionary to India, one of the early fathers of this debate, and is worth reading, although somewhat dated in some way. But Newbegin is clear that the church must not domesticate and must not neuter the gospel by trying to align it with the prevailing wisdom in our own or other societies. In Scripture, something is given which cannot be derived from other sources. Secondly, the simple willingness to accept a plurality of values, cultural norms, and religious dogma leads to what Alan Bloom famously called in his book of the same title, the closing of the American mind. It could be the Western mind, there's nothing particularly American about it, I think. If we are simply willing to say that this is true for me, and you hear that so much, this is true for me, then all views are equally acceptable, then all intellectual rigour is lost. You don't need to debate answers because all views are true for the person who holds them. Views, values, and so on need to be open for public scrutiny. Liberals can close a group's mind just as well as conservatives. Let liberals not attempt to take any high ground. Number 3, Peter Berger says that what we call a rational view of the world is really only, to use his phrase, a plausibility structure. It is a work in progress which allows us to live our lives in a more or less predictable way. But what is plausible changes with advances in knowledge, and so the structures have to be modified, even dismantled. For the Christian, the Jesus story is a better way of understanding life than the prevalent secular plausibility structure. But it will for us always remain so, but when anomalies in our particular view of the world appear, our own faith, anomalies in our own faith view of the world, we need the spiritual courage to rephrase our translation. Rephrase our translation. Number 4, according to Newbegin, this means that Christians are called to indwell their story. It means that I must have a deep sense that the Christian story is a clue to my own story. And at the same time, I, being British, have to live within the modern British plausibility structure. And I must make my Adventist plausibility structure and my British plausibility structure speak to each other, converse in my own being. And I have to do this with vigour and with integrity. 5. The danger facing a global church is that there may be no adequate conversation with the culture with local plausibility structures, that in my case the Adventists and the British would simply not be speaking to each other. If you have a personal story to tell, it must be your story and not a religious karaoke story, not a prepackaged story with the label on the side saying made in the USA. I've seen many people leaving the church or declining eventually to join because they rather regret that the church's plausibility structure is not strong enough to support the weight of their demanding lives embedded in a particular community, either on ordinary days or extraordinary days. 6. In a global church such as ours, there is a tendency to revert to a lowest common denominator language which simply does not translate well locally. I'll give you a controversial example. Consider the music that we sing. There was a certain stage where I used to get fed up with going to different locations in the Adventist world and singing Majesty. Just the same sorts of choruses spread throughout the world, and it's kind of a lowest common denominator religion emerges. I'm not interested in that. I don't know about you. 7. The great missionary proclamations of the Book of Acts of the Apostles come in response to the questions asked by the local people, not at the initiative of the apostles. Mission is above all about faithful communities which flourish by living a story. Thus, we need churches embedded in wider local secular communities rather than do what we often do, which is namely, many of us here would have to confess this, we live in ghettos of believers in one place, or we belong to commuter churches with little contact with the host community. If Adventism continues to do that, it dies, in my view. The Adventist church, has to learn to embody the gospel in its own culture without that culture distorting it. All of this involves a costly identification and involvement with others. And I fear that many of us in this room are too involved with our work to be a lively member of the community which surrounds the place where we work, the place where we live, or the place where we worship. Our work keeps us from our local community. Number 8, the contemporary Christian thinker, British thinker, John Milbank, offers us another clue in the title of his book, Radical Orthodoxy. He edited it actually in 1999. Using a postmodern approach, he uses a strong critique of liberalism and pluralism and calls us to revisit our orthodoxy. We have succeeded in translating our orthodoxy into something much less than radical. According to Milbank, he is very outspoken. According to Milbank, Christian dialogue with others is often futile and can produce some very anemic results because the conversation is often about rather neutral subjects where there is hope of agreement, say in the area of social justice. He says that those from different faith traditions or different parts of the same tradition should not be seeking to agree with each other. Rather, we should acknowledge that we treat each other with mutual suspicion. We have to say that we're suspicious of other Christians, other Adventists, because I know you are, you've told me. And if we did that, he says, Milbank says, we should be seeking to surprise each other with compellingly lucid insights into our own tradition. Following him, we would say that we need not go away from Adventism, but deep into it, to revisit Adventism as for the first time, to question and be questioned, and to be prepared to be disturbed from the complacency of our often rehearsed answers. I think we got lazy, and I think the Adventist imagination too often at the moment is just asleep, and it's a shame to us. 8. Brian McLaren provides us with a further clue in the title of his book, A Generous Orthodoxy. Translation is best done with a warm and open welcome to our own orthodoxy, which has sustained us so well. It is an orthodoxy which listens carefully to incomers. That is to openly and warmly invite people into our own orthodoxy, because for us it is tried and tested. A fuller expression of McLaren's idea of a generous orthodoxy is to be found in number 9, in Luke Bretherton's book, Hospitality as Holiness. When you come across a stranger who is in many ways quite other than you, you can welcome them to your home. You can offer hospitality, food, drink, the opportunity to wash themselves, and so on. But you can also open your mind to them, to extend to them the hospitality of really listening, which is a very rare gift nowadays. Our Adventist good listeners. Strangers always bring gifts. It's a clear biblical teaching. Mere tolerance of plurality, which is pluralism, is not enough. The biblical alternative is hospitality. I commend it to you. The guest becomes part of the household for a brief while. Somebody is owed hospitality just because she is a stranger. And I use she deliberately because that opens up a whole different vista on otherness in Adventism at the moment. And I'm going to ignore that, but our church cannot afford to. And if it does by 215, I fear for the consequences. 2015. How long can we deny hospitality to our sisters in Christ? The hospitable home maintains its identity but does not coerce the visitor. Neither does it remain quite the same as it was before she came. The stranger's visit has changed something for good. God's Spirit helps us to be hosts without being overrun by guests. I put it to you, that is what we most fear. We fear most that we will somehow be overrun by the people to whom we offer some kind of hospitality. And I suspect that at the whole basis of this discussion about pluralism, at the bottom of it all is fear. Fear of the other. And yet we serve one who told us, do not be afraid, that it is love that casts out fear. But I have a feeling that we have some kind of institutional fear which inhibits us at the moment. Jesus celebrated with aliens. Jesus' hospitality was shocking to the guardians of the traditions, to the guardians of the purity of Israel. Jesus acknowledges that there is a tension between holiness and hospitality, and he does not try to resolve it. Benedictine monasteries would often have a monk posted at the door whose job specifically was to welcome anybody who might arrive at the monastery, to welcome them to receive the benefits of life together in the house. Hospitality, hospital, hospice. Maybe the hospice movement has something to teach the church. In a hospice, all are actively welcomed, whatever terminal disease they may have. All are given the opportunity to engage with the most important experience of their lives. Those important experiences of life need people going through those very important experiences of their lives need our hospitality. The church should become a hospitality centre. So to conclude, withdrawal is not an option for the church. Assimilation is not an option. Warfare is not an option. Hospitality is the only option because the gospel is the great story of God's costly hospitality to us. And lastly, to the most difficult of all questions that I have to pose, and it is not a philosophical question, it is a personal question. In macrocosm, we live in a plural world. In microcosm, we live in plural families. So my question is this: how have you managed the business of translating the gospel to our own families, to our spouses, and perhaps most specifically to our own adult children? How have we managed to translate the gospel to the next generation, to our own flesh and blood? For some of us, that will be a very painful question, I know. And it's for nobody else but ourselves, or outside the family circle, to judge. But it's a very important question. How have we managed to translate the gospel to our own adult children? We may well reflect and regret that much has been lost in translation. This highly personal question may be very helpful in allowing us to approach the larger question of the conference truthfully. And there is a danger in a conference like this that we all say what other people want us to say and not really tell the truth. I believe that unless we are honestly prepared to face this particular question about translating the gospel to our own adult children, unless we are prepared to face that question, anything else which might be said at this conference is nothing more than a footnote. Thank you.